In the year 1066, the winds of change swept across England as the sun set on the reign of King Edward the Confessor. For over 2 decades, Edward had ruled England with piety and devotion, earning him the title, the Confessor, for his deep religious faith. But as winter approached in early January, the aging king fell gravely ill. On the 5th day of that fateful month, Edward the Confessor breathed his last, leaving behind no sons, no direct heirs, and a kingdom trembling on the edge of chaos. His death plunged England into a crisis of succession unlike any the realm had seen. The royal council, known as the Witan, gathered in haste. Powerful nobles stirred with ambition, each calculating their position in the coming storm. At the heart of this struggle stood Harold Godwinson, the formidable Earl of Wessex and the most powerful nobleman in all of England. Harold was no stranger to power. He had served as Edward's closest advisor, commanded armies, and governed vast territories. Some claimed that on his deathbed, Edward himself had named Harold as his successor. Backed by the English nobility and blessed by the Witan, Harold claimed the throne. Within hours of Edward's death, Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. But his coronation, though swift and decisive, ignited rival claims from across the sea. 2 men, both fierce and ambitious, believed the English crown belonged to them, and both were prepared to take it by force. The first was Harold Hardrada, the legendary king of Norway and perhaps the most fearsome Viking warrior of the age. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, Hardrada, whose name meant hard ruler, had spent decades fighting across Scandinavia, the Byzantine Empire, and the Mediterranean. He claimed England through an ancient treaty and saw Harold Godwinson as nothing more than a usurper who had stolen what was rightfully his. The second challenger was William, Duke of Normandy, a cunning and ruthless leader who ruled the lands across the English Channel. William claimed that years earlier, Harold himself had sworn a sacred oath to support William's claim to the English throne. Whether this oath was given freely or under duress remains debated to this day, but William believed Harold had broken his word, and for that he would pay in blood. William also secured the backing of Pope Alexander II, who blessed his invasion as a holy crusade, granting William not just political legitimacy but divine favor. England, it seemed, was set on a path toward war. And Harold Godwinson, the newly crowned king, would have to fight for every inch of his realm. Late that summer, as Harold prepared his defenses along the southern coast, expecting William's invasion at any moment, disaster struck from the north. A massive Viking invasion fleet, led by Harold Hardrada and supported by Harold's own exiled brother Tostig Godwinson, descended upon northern England. Over 300 Viking longships crossed the North Sea, carrying perhaps 10,000 warriors hungry for conquest and glory. The northern English earls, Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria, marched to intercept the invaders. At the Battle of Fulford, just south of York, they fought bravely but were overwhelmed by the ferocity and experience of the Viking horde. York itself surrendered shortly after, agreeing to provide hostages and supplies to Hardrada's army. The Vikings, confident in their dominance, camped at Stamford Bridge to await the English tribute. When news of the northern invasion reached Harold in London, he faced an agonizing choice. His forces were positioned in the south, ready to repel William's expected landing. But if he did nothing, the entire north of England would fall to the Vikings. Harold made his decision with the speed and decisiveness that defined his reign. He would march north, defeat Hardrada, and return south before William could strike. What followed was one of the most extraordinary military marches in medieval history. Harold gathered his elite housecarls, professional warriors bound to him by oath, and the feigned, England's militia, and set out for Yorkshire. Covering nearly 200 miles in just 4 days, Harold's army moved with astonishing speed, arriving at Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066, before the Vikings even knew they were coming. The battle that followed was brutal and decisive. Hardrada's army, caught completely off guard and without much of their armor, scrambled to form a defensive position. A legendary moment occurred when a single Viking warrior held the narrow bridge alone, cutting down dozens of Englishmen before finally being slain. But numbers and surprise proved decisive. By the end of the day, Harold Hardrada lay dead, Tostig Godwinson was killed, and the Viking army was shattered. The age of Viking invasions of England had come to an end. Harold had achieved a stunning victory, one of the greatest triumphs of his career. Yet victory came at a terrible cost. His army was exhausted, bloodied, and hundreds of miles from home. Many of his best warriors had fallen. As his men celebrated their hard-won triumph and tended to their wounded, a messenger arrived from the south, breathless and dust-covered. The news he brought turned celebration into dread. William, Duke of Normandy, had landed on England's shores. On September 28, just 3 days after Stamford Bridge, William's invasion fleet of perhaps 700 ships crossed the English Channel and landed at Pevensey Bay on the southern coast. His army, numbering around 7,000 men, disembarked without opposition and immediately began fortifying their position. William's forces consisted of Norman knights, Breton cavalry, Flemish mercenaries, and archers, a professional, well-equipped army unlike anything England had faced before. William wasted no time. He ravaged the surrounding countryside, burning villages and seizing supplies, deliberately provoking Harold to march south and face him in open battle. The Norman Duke knew that time was not on his side. The longer he remained on the coast, the more Harold's strength would grow as reinforcements arrived from across England. William needed a decisive battle, and he needed it soon. When word reached Harold in Yorkshire, he faced yet another impossible choice. His army desperately needed rest. Reinforcements were gathering across the kingdom, and prudence suggested he wait, consolidate his forces, and approach the Norman invasion with overwhelming strength. But Harold also knew that every day William remained unchallenged, English lands burned and English people suffered. Moreover, waiting would give William time to fortify and expand his control. Harold made his decision. Despite exhaustion, despite losses, despite the pleas of his advisors to wait, Harold immediately marched his army south once more. It was a decision born of courage, duty, and perhaps pride, but it would prove to be a fateful gamble. By early October, Harold had reached London. He paused briefly to gather what additional forces he could muster, though many of his northern levies remained behind, too exhausted or wounded to continue. Fresh troops from the southern shires joined him, but they lacked the experience and discipline of his veteran warriors. Still, Harold was determined. On October 13th, he marched from London toward Hastings, where William's army awaited. On the morning of October 14, 1066, as dawn broke over the English countryside, the two armies faced each other near Hastings, at a place the English called Senlac Hill. Harold positioned his forces atop this hill, a strong defensive position overlooking the battlefield below. The hilltop gave his army the high ground, forcing any attacker to fight uphill, exhausting themselves before they even reached the English lines. Harold's army numbered roughly 6,000 men, though some estimates place it higher. His force consisted almost entirely of infantry. At the core stood his housecarls, the elite warriors of Anglo-Saxon England. These men were professional soldiers, sworn to fight and die for their king. They wore chainmail armor, carried large round shields, and wielded the fearsome Danish axe, a two-handed weapon capable of cleaving through shield, armor, and bone with a single stroke. Supporting the housecarls were the feigned, England's militia, made up of freemen from towns and shires across the kingdom. They were less well-armored and less experienced, but they were defending their homes, and that gave them strength. Though weary from weeks of fighting and forced marches, Harold's army was battle-hardened and resolute. They formed the traditional Saxon shield wall, a tight defensive formation where overlapping shields created an almost impenetrable barrier. Behind this wall, axes and spears bristled like the quills of a hedgehog. It was a formation that had defended England for generations, and Harold trusted it would hold once more. Below the hill stood William's army, estimated at around 7,000 strong, though the true number remains debated by historians. Unlike Harold's force, the Normans were a balanced and diverse fighting machine. William commanded Norman knights and infantry, Breton cavalry from Brittany, Flemish mercenaries, and skilled archers. His soldiers wore chainmail hauberks, carried kite-shaped shields, and wielded swords, spears, and lances. But William's greatest advantage was his cavalry. Mounted knights, armored and trained in the shock tactics of continental warfare, were a weapon Harold largely lacked. The English had few horses and even fewer trained cavalry. This difference in military composition would prove crucial in the hours to come. Above William's ranks flew the Norman war banner, the oriflamme, a symbol of conquest, legitimacy, and divine favor granted by the Pope himself. William had more than military might on his side. He believed God favored his cause, and that conviction gave strength to his men. As midday approached, William rode before his army atop his warhorse, a commanding figure in chainmail and helm. He addressed his troops, his voice carrying across the ranks. He reminded them of their courage, their skill, and their righteous cause. This land, he proclaimed, would be theirs. Honor, glory, wealth, and destiny awaited them atop that hill. All they had to do was take it. At William's command, the battle began. Norman archers advanced first, loosing their arrows in high arcs toward the hilltop. Hundreds of arrows filled the sky, a deadly rain designed to weaken and demoralize the English before the main assault. But Harold had prepared his men well. At his shouted command, the shield wall tightened. Shields rose and overlapped, creating a wooden roof over the Saxon lines. Arrows clattered harmlessly against shields and armor. Some found their marks, and men fell, but the shield wall held firm, absorbing the attack with minimal damage. Realizing that archery alone would not break the Saxons, William ordered the next phase. Norman infantry and cavalry surged forward, advancing up the slope in disciplined ranks. The cavalry, normally devastating on flat ground, struggled on the uneven, muddy hillside. The slope robbed them of speed and momentum, the very qualities that made cavalry charges so deadly. At the crest of the hill, they crashed into the unyielding Saxon shield wall. The impact was thunderous. The clash of wood, iron, and flesh echoed across the valley. The fighting was savage and brutal. Norman knights thrust spears and swung swords against the shield wall, but the English stood firm. Housecarls wielded their great axes with terrifying effect, cleaving through helmets, splitting shields, and cutting down horses and riders alike. Men screamed, bled, and died in the churning chaos of close combat. Again and again, the Normans charged. Again and again, they were repelled. Bodies piled at the foot of the hill, and the grass turned slick with blood. Despite their courage and discipline, the Normans could not break through. Hours passed, and William began to realize the grim truth: a direct frontal assault would fail. The shield wall was too strong, the hill too steep, and the Saxons too determined. He needed a new strategy. As his cavalry withdrew downhill to regroup, confusion suddenly spread along the Norman left flank. Some soldiers misinterpreted the withdrawal as a full retreat. Panic rippled through the ranks, and men began pulling back entirely, fearing the battle was lost. Seeing this apparent retreat, discipline among sections of the Saxon army broke. Eager younger warriors, perhaps from the less experienced Ford, surged forward in pursuit, breaking formation and abandoning the safety of the shield wall, a fatal mistake. At that very moment, a dangerous rumor swept through the Norman army. William himself had been killed. Panic threatened to turn into full rout. The battle hung in the balance. William, however, was very much alive. Recognizing the crisis, he acted with decisive courage. He rode through his army, lifting his helmet high so all could see his face. "I live," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Look at me. I'm here. Fight on, for victory is ours." His presence, his voice, his leadership restored order and rekindled hope. The Norman ranks steadied. Then William struck. He led his knights in a sudden, savage counterattack against the exposed Saxon warriors who had foolishly broken formation and pursued down the hill. Cut off from their comrades and surrounded in the open field, they were swiftly encircled and slaughtered. It was a brutal lesson in the importance of discipline. But for William, it was also a revelation. The unintended feigned retreat had drawn the Saxons out and led to their destruction. What if he did it again, on purpose? Learning from this bloody success, William adopted a new and cunning strategy. He ordered repeated feigned retreats, using them as a deliberate tactic to lure more Saxon troops away from their defensive positions. Norman cavalry would charge uphill, clash briefly with the shield wall, then wheel around and gallop back down as if fleeing in panic. Time after time, groups of Saxons took the bait, breaking formation to pursue what they believed was a beaten foe. And time after time, disciplined Norman knights would suddenly turn, charge back, and crush the pursuing Saxons in the open field where they were vulnerable. Slowly but surely, the once solid shield wall began to fracture. Gaps appeared. Casualties mounted. Harold's army, which had stood unbroken for hours, was being bled dry. By late afternoon, exhaustion and attrition had taken their toll. Harold desperately tried to reorganize his men, shouting orders, plugging gaps in the line, and rallying his housecarls to hold firm. But the losses were too great, and his army had been fighting since dawn without rest. Then came the decisive moment, the blow that would change the course of history. As the Norman archers loosed another volley, one arrow arced high into the air and descended toward the hilltop where King Harold stood among his banners. Tradition holds that the arrow struck Harold in the eye, though some accounts suggest he was cut down by Norman knights in the final melee. What is certain is this: Harold Godwinson, King of England, was killed. News of the king's death spread rapidly through the Saxon ranks like wildfire. Morale, already strained, collapsed entirely. The housecarls, bound by oath to defend their king to the death, fought on with grim determination, forming a last desperate ring around Harold's body. But the FRD, the common levies, began to waver. Without their leader, without hope, resistance crumbled. What had been an organized defense turned into a desperate retreat. Men threw down their weapons and fled into the darkening woods. Norman forces surged forward, cutting down fleeing soldiers as the sun set in red and gold over the blood-soaked battlefield. Some Saxons made a final stand in a nearby ravine, but they too were overwhelmed. The Battle of Hastings was over. William had won a decisive and brutal victory, though it had taken all day and cost him dearly. The Anglo-Saxon army was destroyed, King Harold was dead, and England lay defenseless before the Norman conqueror. In the days that followed, resistance continued in scattered pockets. English nobles hesitated, debating whether to crown a new king or negotiate with William. But without a unified leader and with their army shattered, their position was hopeless. Within weeks, William marched unopposed toward London. English lords, bishops, and earls came forward one by one to submit. On Christmas Day, 1066, in Westminster Abbey, William, Duke of Normandy, was crowned King of England, forever remembered as William the Conqueror. The consequences of Hastings were profound and lasting. Anglo-Saxon rule, which had endured for over 6 centuries, came to an abrupt and violent end, replaced by Norman dominance. England's ruling class was swept away, replaced by Norman barons who seized lands and titles. The English language itself was transformed as Norman French mingled with Anglo-Saxon English, creating the roots of modern English. Stone castles, a Norman innovation, rose across the land, symbols of conquest and control. A new feudal system took root, reshaping English society from the ground up.